Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia Overton. I'm the Senior Director of Tech Workplace Initiatives at the KPOR Center, and I would like to welcome you to our discussion, More Than Numbers, the State of Tech Company Data Collection, Reporting, Transparency, and Accountability. This discussion is all about the importance of representation throughout the tech workforce. We've got one big topic broken up into three smaller parts. Part one is with Pastor Joseph Bryant, who is the Executive Director of the Rainbow Push Silicon Valley Diversity Project. Part two is with Chair Charlotte Burrows, who leads the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, also known as the EEOC. And part three is with Dr. Sonia Koshy, who leads research efforts at the KPOR Center, and Alexandria Diaronzetta, who is the founder and CEO of Laurel. Our first speaker is Pastor Joseph Bryant, who is Executive Director of the Rainbow Push Silicon Valley Diversity Project. Welcome, Pastor Bryant.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph Bryant Jr., and I serve as the Executive Director of Silicon Valley, Bay Area, and the West Coast for the Rainbow Push Coalition, leaning in heavily on our diversity and inclusion initiatives under the fantastic leadership of the one and only Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson. In 2014, Reverend Jackson decided to visit Silicon Valley companies to talk about their diversity numbers. He had initially engaged in Silicon Valley in 1999, wanting to be a part of the evolving ecosystem of what was becoming the internet and the vast economic expansion that was coming as a result of it. In 2014, though, we began to go to shareholder meetings and have conversations about diversity, specifically the research that Rainbow Push was doing, asking companies for their EEO1 numbers, asking them to respond to our letters regarding their employment data that would give us a rationale behind our desire to assist those companies in expanding their diverse platforms. And throughout our research, we discovered that so many of these wonderful, amazing, phenomenal companies were doing an amazing job in providing technology, but not including many people of color or women in their workforce. We discovered that out of the 189 board seats that we had asked about from 20 of the top companies in the Valley, there were only 3 African American, only 36 women. We discovered that out of 307 of the C-suite level seats that were being filled at that time, only 6 African American, 3 Latino, and only 65 women. And so the conversation was, we need to use these numbers to help assess our progress and our impact in true and authentic diversification of the Valley and the tech industry. We spoke to one of the legends of the Valley, Mr. Ken Coleman, and he said, data drives diversity, and it will drive us to the place of understanding how to truly have these conversations to show the numbers to the companies. They need to see where they fall short. And that gives us the measurable, tangible means to assess our true progress. It is so important that we continue this drive. And I am so grateful for amazing companies like the KPOR Center and for phenomenal work like the work that Dr. Cynthia Overton does to help to unpeel the onion of reality, that even in moving into a brand new year, we find ourselves still trying to do all we can to fight the fight for inclusion and equality. It's not a matter of whether or not there are talented people, qualified people, or people who are interested in filling the diverse seats that would be made available. It's not a talent deficit, it's an opportunity deficit, and the numbers support that. And so in moments like this, when we're taking a hard look again, some 8 years past our initial endowment into the conversations with the Valley and with the companies, it's so important for us to look at the reality that the diversity that needs to take place should be supported by the numbers reflecting it from the board seats, C-suites, workforce procurement, and all of the variables that are related to the pipelines that will bring about true, authentic inclusion. In a world that's filled with people from every hue and every background and every ethnicity and every type of life expression, it is incumbent upon us to ensure that we have ongoing, consistent data, that we are able to reflect on the numbers to authentically level the playing field, to have goals and targets and be able to have measurable means to see that we are reaching our goals, to ensure that everyone has a chance, that everyone has a place. And the more people that are involved in the process of continuing to move the needle of technology and making diversity a true reality, the better we all are. Reverend Jackson often says that we never knew how good baseball could be until everyone could play. And so thankfully, Jackie Robinson broke the barriers in order to bring everyone to the field. Well, we want to do the same thing in the tech field, and the numbers will help us to get there. And so it's important for us to have these conversations, to have conferences and experiences, to exchange ideas and thoughts, and to be able to ensure that we continue to check the boxes and see the numbers are moving positively forward, to have more people of color, to have more women, and to have more opportunities for all of us. Because unfortunately, when we don't have these folks at the table, our education, our employment, and our economic stability is challenged, and the divide of diversity continues to bridge an unfortunate struggle that we want to make a whole lot closer in these times. So I'm thankful for moments like this, for conferences like this, where we can bridge the digital divide by looking at the numbers, collecting the data, having the hard conversations, and then doing something actionable and tangible to move forward together. And in the words of the legendary Reverend Jesse Jackson, to be able to always keep hope alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Bryant, for your insightful remarks. Now it is a true honor to speak with Chair Charlotte Burrows of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. She was designated by President Biden as chair of the EEOC on January 20th, 2021. Chair Burrows was initially nominated to serve as a commissioner of the EEOC in 2014 and then renominated in 2019. The U.S. Senate unanimously confirmed her to a second term ending in 2023. Now, I'm so excited to speak with her because in 2016, the EEOC released the report Diversity in High Tech, which gave a clear understanding of workforce demographics in Silicon Valley tech companies and across all of high tech. Now, the report was so helpful at increasing data transparency that the K-4 Center teamed up with collaborating organizations and submitted a letter to the EEOC requesting an updated report. We are eager to understand how demographics have shifted over the last few years since the report released in 2016. And so now I'm just delighted to speak with Chair Burrows to learn more about the work of the EEOC and how it's helping to ensure that all people have opportunities to enter the tech workforce. So Chair Burrows, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for your interest in our work. I am so delighted to have the chance to talk about some of the really exciting work that we have underway at the Commission. And, as you will not be surprised, fostering diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in employment are really top priorities for our agency. And our focus includes the tech industry, as you so, elegantly teed it up, because obviously this is an increasingly important part of our economy, both in terms of jobs, but also really because the expanding role that technology plays in all of our lives is so critical. And I appreciate your interest in the report, and I'm very excited that we are going to be looking into those issues again and really sort of diving into it to see where we are now.
That is very exciting. That's good news to hear. That report has supported a lot of folks who are working so hard to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging throughout the tech industry. So as we start our conversation, can you please tell us just a little bit of background information about EEO-1 data?
Absolutely. Happy to talk about that. And it's interesting because the name is not as exciting as it might as the actual substance of it, but I find it, just really an important part of our work. The EEOC has an annual survey of private sector employers that we call the EEO1. And just to put it in context, the EEOC is the agency created in direct response to the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And we actually started way back in 1966 looking at demographic data from private sector employees so that we could have a perspective on the issues of diversity. So each year, private sector employers with 100 or more employees, and also federal contractors that have at least 50 employees, are required to submit an EEO1 report, which shows workforce demographic data by job category, race, ethnicity, and sex. And that EEO1 report is really a rich snapshot of our nation's workforce. So for example, the EEOC received over 8,500 EEO1 reports for calendar year 2018, and those included demographic data on approximately 56 million employees. I believe that our data collections also for 2019 and 2020 are just closing, and I know that we received well over 70,000 EEO1 reports. So it's really a wealth, if you will, a real treasure trove of data. And one thing that I would love to just make sure folks know about is that we have, since about late 2020, created a tool called EEOC Explore that allows the public actually to take a look at that EEO1 data for really the first time. It's obviously scrubbed for privacy protections because under our statutes, we're not allowed to personally identify the individual companies. But the overarching sense within various industries, for instance, is really helpful. And it's a user-friendly look. The public can look at the workforce demographic trends across a number of categories, and that includes location and industry sector. And you don't need a degree in computer programming or statistics to really have it be something that's useful. So really excited about that as well.
Awesome. Can you talk a little bit about the legal limitations that companies have when collecting these data points? I know that, there are a lot of questions about, well, are we allowed to ask and how are we supposed to get this type of information? Can you kind of clear the record for folks who really need support in terms of what they are allowed to do and what they cannot do when it comes to collecting these data?
Absolutely. Sure. I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, the EEOC itself does not make public the report by report name, and obviously no individual worker is identified. But for issues, let's say like race and ethnicity, the best practice for employers is really to rely on voluntary self-identification, but there's no concern with asking it. So as long as people, are in the mode of, hey, give us this information voluntarily and the context of it, there's not a restriction on asking those questions. And so for questions like sex or gender, many employers already are collecting that information as part of the onboarding process. And there's also a really interesting and very, very important discussion that's ongoing, both for private sector and public sector right now, about whether there's any sort of gender marker question in a data collection that needs to include an option for persons who don't identify as male or female. And that, for instance, is something that more than 20 states have already allowed to have an indication either as a X for a gender marker or, instead of M or F for male or female, so that you are sensitive and also can collect information about persons whose gender identity doesn't fit into that binary mode. And so in the coming years, I anticipate that these X gender markers will become even more widespread. And for employers that have already adopted some form of collecting gender markers that are beyond just the sort of traditional binary, they can report that information in the comments section of the EEO1 already. And we're sort of looking forward into, in the future, sort of a conversation about how we might expand or broaden some of those categories as well.
Great, thank you. Now I'm going to ask if you can give us a little history lesson here. Can you speak a little bit about the impetus behind the diversity in high tech report? I know that it was released in 2016. We know that in 2014 and 2015 there was a lot of discussion around some of the tech companies that were suing to keep their data private. And then 2016 comes around and you release this report. Can you just tell us what happened and why you released it? And also, can you give us insight in terms of the social context that was happening at the time?
Well, let me say this. The high-tech sector is really a major source of jobs and job growth in the United States. And that was true at the time that we put out the report, and was something that we were really focused on. It's also important to really keep in mind that the high-tech industry is broader than just the household names in Silicon Valley, although those are obviously important. But high-tech jobs exist in industries like manufacturing too. And so this really vibrant and growing area of the economy, it's so critical that we have diversity there where the jobs are. Obviously, our statutes protect against discrimination regardless. And our work applies regardless, but you really want to pay attention to those industries where you see job growth, because that's where the action is. And so it's been really for us for some time now, both a moral and a business imperative that we look at very closely at diversity in this area. And I think that's something that many companies are seeing it that way too. For any company that's trying to create the innovations of tomorrow, you really have to have diversity of backgrounds and voices that are participating in the creative process. Otherwise, you're going to end up with blind spots and sort of miss something important about the consumers that you're trying to reach. And so I know also that a number of the tech companies actually decided sort of proactively somewhere in that time span that you just mentioned to start putting out their own EEO1 reports, or sort of more recently, or to at least start talking about those issues more publicly. And so all of that was sort of in the mix as the conversation, as we looked at this, but it was really about where the jobs are and how we could most be effective. And so really, if you are, sort of looking at it more broadly and from the perspective of business, if you're a company that's trying to appeal to everyone, regardless of race or sex, and when I say sex, I of course include sexual orientation and gender identity, or age, religion, disability, etc., then you really need people from all of those groups that are providing input during your creative process. And for tech touches everyone. Everyone is using those products, and really has, having that broad diversity. What a lot of companies are telling us is that's really going to help them figure out what products their clients, their market wants. And so our report, which was came out in 2016, based on 2014 data, because that was the most recent at the time. We're fortunate to be able to kind of get the data a little bit more quickly now, but we were really startled, I guess, to find a significant underrepresentation of women and racial minorities in high-tech jobs. And just to put that in perspective, compared to private industry as a whole, you saw in the tech sector much larger percentages of whites and Asian Americans and men. And at EEOC, really, thanks to the growing momentum we have today around diversity and the work of the K-4 Center and civil rights groups and businesses that are focused on these issues, has really helped in that regard. And so we are taking a really fresh look at the more recent EEO1 reports to see if the high-tech industry has closed some of those gaps in representation since our 2016 report. So we hope to be coming back to you sometime in 2020 to talk about that in detail and let you know what we found. So really excited about the work that we're doing there. And I would love to just, share with you one other tech-related issue that we've just sort of launched recently, which is really an exciting project that we have underway at the EEOC, our initiative to examine the civil rights implications of using artificial intelligence or AI and other algorithmic-based tools in recruitment and hiring and screening of new employees, which is sometimes framed as a way to reduce the risk of implicit bias and the risk of, frankly, as a diversity measure. But AI has sometimes got unintended consequences. And so we're really looking to make sure that those do not undermine the diversity goals that many companies have right now. So for example, we've seen in job interviews that some companies are using software that tries to read your facial expression or analyze your tone of voice. And that software can, make a prediction about whether you might be able to deal with a difficult customer or cooperate with your coworkers. But the problem is it's not calibrated for every, cultural background and accents, and it can make really negative predictions about non-native English speakers. So there are a lot of other issues that come up sometime with AI. So we're going to be looking at that. I'm happy to talk about it in as much detail as you're interested in, but I wanted to put a flag and a marker out there that's really an ongoing interest of the EEOC, and you'll be seeing and hearing a lot from us about that in 2022 as well.
2022. So I'm very anxious. Any thoughts on what quarter in 2022 so we can look out for it?
With respect to the AI sort of initiative, we are going to be, I think you're going to be hearing from us in pretty much every quarter of 2022. We launched the sort of the initiative in October. So that's technically the very first quarter of 2022, if you, at least in terms of the government speak, but we will be holding some really key conversations with experts and trying to identify different ways that AI is working. And I think it has a connection to this diversity issue, because as you have more diverse employees at tech companies, which are creating some of these screening tools, you may start to see that some of the assumptions that are built into them may not have the same kinds of unintended consequences. With respect to the report, I'm not going to make any predictions today, but really excited about that work. And I promise you that I will be in touch as soon as we are ready to push it out.
So I'm such a fan of the Diversity in High Tech report. I just got to ask, how has that been received over the past several years?
We have gotten tremendous, tremendous feedback on it. We had a hearing when that was rolled out. So the commission actually has public hearings. It's still on our website, and I think that all of the evidence that we took at that time was really timely and directly on point. So it was introduced at a hearing, and one of the things that came out of that was sort of a lot of really interesting ideas around ways to push forward on that. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility are all things that we are going to be talking about a lot in 2022 broadly. And again, tech will be right at the center of it. So we got tremendous response from the Hill, from the public. And we know, though, that it's been a while, and we really need to pick that work back up and run with it. And that's what we intend to do.
Great. And then can you tell us about the future of EEO data? What does it look like? Will the job categories change? Will you add disability to reporting? You mentioned accessibility, so.
Accessibility really, and disability issues really needs to be all along the way part of diversity efforts. And I think in a lot of places it is, but not as often as you would imagine. So as I mentioned a little earlier, there are conversations ongoing about what kinds of issues should be included with, whether there should be broader categories. With respect to the current EEO1 we've been collecting since 1966, It, of course, predates the ADA. So at the time we started it, it was really just focused on Title VII, obviously very important. So sex, race, and national origin. And the question of broadening that out is something that we have heard from civil rights groups and are really thinking about taking a fresh look at that and to see where we, might want to broaden. But in terms of how you might actually look at that, it's really important to understand that the data really depends on people being willing to be self-identified. And so going back to the question of how people might, be willing to do that. So let's talk about, since you brought up disability, whether or not people who are not otherwise known to their employer are comfortable doing that will really be something that I think would require some sort of real messaging by the agency and the employers. That is an area as well where some employers have traditionally not been, been a little squeamish because of the way the ADA interacts about asking for that. So that's something that if we really need to think about what kind of data we get, but it's definitely interesting. There's also a lot of discussion about whether job categories on the EEO1, such as professionals and technicians, should be more specific. And it's important to keep that in mind as we sort of weigh that as well, whether or not we might end up inadvertently limiting our ability to do some sort of, if you will, sort of apples to apples comparison from the past when our past data had different categories. So we are looking at all of those things in we have a great set of real data experts at the EEOC who are really schooled in the sort of issues around data collection and how to get it right, and looking at all of those things. But that conversation is definitely ongoing. And the real question is what changes may do to the accuracy and whether or not we're going to be able to use it for our law enforcement purposes. And, there are sensitivities around issues like collecting disability and sexual orientation, gender identity, and information as well. So we're thinking through all of those questions.
Great. And then what's the moonshot for the EEOC to drive diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging across dynamic and morphing sectors? So we're thinking about from startups to private and public companies.
Well, I love that question. I love the idea of the moonshot. And so we are always thinking big picture and vision. And here, the goal is really to increase diverse, equitable, inclusive, and fully accessible workplaces across the high-tech sector. And that means fostering respectful workplaces. So really, just to cut to the chase at a minimum, those are workplaces that are free from unlawful harassment and retaliation, but it's so much broader than that. The key is to foster the kind of culture where everyone, including members of previously underrepresented groups, feel equally included and are valued rather than isolated or tokenized. And so it really is about those kinds of workplaces that value everyone. And the challenge sometimes for the tech sector is really figuring out how to balance the culture of innovation and creativity, which is so valuable, but at the same time, sometimes requires questioning old assumptions and disrupting norms. And on the other hand, you need to balance that with the need to remain vigilant about civil rights laws and creating workplaces that are affirming and inclusive for everyone. And those are really the, sort of two touchstones, if you will. And there are things that at a bottom line that we really encourage, I think, folks to do as they try to create those respectful workplaces. And it's quite simple. The first is making sure that at the very top, there's a message that is clear about the value that the organization places on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as core to the organization. And the second is really ensuring that those middle managers and the supervisors who kind of make the action happen understand that it's their responsibility to live by those values and ensure they're part of the day-to-day experience of everyone there, and also hold them accountable and empower them with the right kind of training about how it is they're supposed to do that. So we've spent a ton of time looking at these issues, as you can imagine, especially around harassment and Me Too issues, but much more broadly as well. And so there are a lot of resources on our website, and respectful workplace training that we developed, but those are really the keys. And, as we wrestle with the aftermath of really the calls for racial justice around the really tragic death of George Floyd and so many of the other difficult conversations that we've had, we are also at the EEOC thinking about opportunity. Because as this nation thinks about what the legacy of all of those issues really is, we have the chance to, ensure that we are, moving forward toward a stronger and better vision for all of us, and that includes in the workplace as well.
Well, that sounds like a great place to end. I want you to know, though, that the work that you and your colleagues do is so important to the folks who are trying to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the workplace throughout the tech industry. So thank you so much for everything that you do. Your work is so important and valuable.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to future conversations.
Thank you. I am excited to transition into our conversation with Dr. Sonia Koshy and Alexandria de Aranzeta to discuss how EEOC data impacts strategic decisions across the tech sector. So Alex and Sonia, let's just start off with a little bit of background about yourself. Can you tell me about yourself, what you do? Alex, I'd love to start with you if that's okay.
Absolutely. And first, thank you, Dr. Overton, and also much thanks to the Kapoor Center for hosting this really important conversation. So my name's Alex de Aranzeta. I'm an Atlanta-based entrepreneur and founder of Laurel, which is an HR tech SaaS for employee relations. Before I dove into startup world, I actually worked as an investigator and a mediator, resolving several hundred cases of harassment and discrimination, and also helping companies review their policies and strengthen their policies around harassment in the workplace.
Great, thank you. And Sonia.
Right. So I am Sonia Koshy. I am the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at the Kapoor Center. I've been here for about 5 years. Really, one is to assess the impact of the various initiatives and programs that the Kapoor Center hosts and holds and puts on in the community. And then the second component is the research aspect. So we typically end up doing landscape reports on how the tech ecosystem in general is doing with respect to racial equity and also gender equity, and to really try to hold accountable the tech sector to do better by the people.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Sonia, I want to start this first question with you. And it relates, of course, to the EEOC data. How easy or hard is it to access EEOC data? And we know that the way that tech companies report out demographic data can be confusing sometimes. Can you speak to how you've seen these data reported out publicly and what this means for understanding what's happening in the tech workplace? What's still missing? What should we be asking for? Would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. So coming off of last year, where we just did a series of reports on Black and Latinx in tech workforce, a data brief, this is very fresh in my mind just because it was such a struggle to get the data. And I think that with the EEOC, there's not necessarily a standardized way in which tech companies are necessarily cutting the data that is meaningful for us to use to look at technical versus non-technical roles and to really unpack who's getting what job and how are the companies actually making progress year over year. And we're essentially relying upon each of the tech companies to self-report and to also publish their own EEOC reports that they actually file with the federal government. And what that means essentially is that if there's not necessarily a database that I can immediately go to and look at the top 30 tech companies, what I end up having to do is do individual searches for each of those companies and looking at whether or not they have their EEOC numbers on their website, and then how are they broken out. And since for the broader EEOC numbers, they don't necessarily have to report out who are tech employees and what is the racial and gender breakdown. Not everyone does it. So again, if we're thinking about holding companies accountable, there isn't an accountability mechanism by which they are held accountable. And so how do we push for progress if there is no standardized way to do so?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, Alex, as an entrepreneur, you know firsthand how the culture of a company gets created in its early stages as a startup. But we know that EEOC data requirements are not necessarily applicable to startups or private companies. What impact is this having in the goal of creating a more transparent and accountable tech sector overall? And what impact is this having on building a future workforce now?
Great question. So the beauty of startups is that they're first. They lead because they can. They innovate and iterate quickly where other companies simply cannot. And interestingly, some of the early stage startups that I've had conversations with who are looking at their people strategy, innovating from within to ensure equity across multiple lines of business. And they're considering strategies to ensure greater diversity in hiring, even at employee 5, and not waiting for an entity to instruct them when or what to do. And so that said, demographic data, of course, can be an important and critical tool for providing insight into a company's cultural health and commitment to diversity. For example, capturing self-reported data can help leaders anticipate these potential gaps, help structure teams, help structure compensation very early as a company quickly scales, which is often the case with startups. And maybe more importantly, it can also show improvement in the representation that can help attract prospective candidates, especially from historically underserved and equity deserving groups. But even absent any requirement to report this kind of data, there are still really meaningful ways for a small business and a small startup to try to work toward greater transparency and work toward greater accountability. And one of those ways is really all about the architecture. And for smaller teams, this means focusing on the product. This means focusing on the team. This means focusing on the customer and mapping where there's opportunity to strengthen, to grow, and to build upon the foundations that have already been laid with respect to diversity, equity, and their inclusive practices. For example, like in their product development, in their customer journey mapping, and research methodologies around design, inclusive design, in the company's social causes, where are they committing themselves in terms of philanthropy, in their culture of engagement? Is there a culture of engagement? Things that are going to stick in the long term because they're embedded. And then startups have to talk about it. Small businesses and tech, they have to talk about it. They have to make sure prospective candidates know about their efforts so that they can consider them when job seeking. And another important question that you raise is, what impact is this having on building a future workforce? That's a fantastic question, because recent news articles, I think we've seen them over the last several months throughout 2021. They are citing numbers somewhere around 80% of millennials and Gen Z workforce job seekers who are actually looking at workforce diversity and when they're evaluating companies and also when they're evaluating offers. So it seems also that about half or just under half of job seekers actually wouldn't even apply to a company if they didn't know about what they were doing in terms of diversity and inclusion. And so the future of workforce is making decisions about where to work and where they want to work based on what commitment they see. So it kind of only means that the future of workplace is going to have to be even more transparent about representation, about inclusion in order to compete.
Thank you. Sonia, can you please talk about what the Diversity in High Tech report has meant for advancing diversity and inclusion in tech? And what is the role of racial justice and tech policy in furthering tech company data collection, reporting, transparency, and accountability?
So the high tech report was really the impetus for a lot of these high tech companies to self-report their own data. And so it was really the start of this larger push for greater transparency. And also now, it's been kind of developmental, right? So initially it was just, let's just get out the bare bones. But now what we're seeing is that there's greater nuances being made with respect to each of those companies and what they're reporting. Not saying that everyone does it the same way, but when you take a look at, for example, Netflix, what they've started to do is really to think through pieces like what's the makeup of leadership, what's the makeup of technical leaders versus non-technical leaders. And then there's also, of course, the technical and non-technical roles beyond leadership. And so just being able to see this developmental change has also been a shift in how companies have been doing it. And that really started with that initial report put out in 2014. And even if you take a look at all of the news articles that have come out, they still reference that initial report as to where did tech companies start and where has it gone. It hasn't gone very far, but that really was the beginning of at least being able to report in some sort of fashion. I think that with respect to what's the role of policy? Again, we're thinking about it from an ecosystem perspective at the KPOR Center. So it's not necessarily that we can just rely upon individual organizations to make changes for everyone. We also need policy to work in alignment and in parallel with the individual organizations, and also the organizational leadership to think about it holistically of if these policies are in place with respect to data transparency, that's just one piece of the puzzle. It's not enough that there's the top 10 tech companies that are reporting in any sort of reliant way. We need all tech companies to report in a reliable manner so that we can push the entire industry forward. We're not talking about just Silicon Valley or just the tech hubs, but how do we push the nation forward? And this is just a burgeoning conversation. And I think that it's burgeoning, but also the same conversation that's been happening. And policy really needs to start thinking about ways in which it needs to meet the needs of people, like what Alex was saying. If the newer workforce is pushing for transparency, then the government needs to meet the needs of its individual citizens so that we can all work together for the greater good.
Thank you. My next question is for Alex. As someone with investigative experience in harassment in the workplace who has relied on EEO data, how can EEO data help tech companies reimagine their internal approach to investigations through the lens of prevention?
Thank you for these important questions. So as you know, I've been an investigator, external and internal, and a mediator of civil rights issues for a number of years. In doing that work, I gained insight into no short of several hundred companies, processes, and saw really what works well. And I've also seen what doesn't work well and where accountability practices have fallen short, usually because of a lack of process, lack of experience, some manual record keeping, and a lack of transparency. And almost always, there was at least one early indicator that something was going amiss at some point. And so I believe that there is power in being able to identify culture concerns earlier using certain data. Investigations have historically, and even currently, they've been responsive, quite reactive, but they don't have to be. There is an opportunity for early intervention over time, with really in two ways. One, building in this practice of capturing concern data or issue data as you go. And also number two, sharing it anonymized and as an aggregate with executive leadership, and then internally making that decision as to how to share that further. Ultimately, companies can't control or prevent, unfortunately, how people will think or behave, but companies can control how they respond by regularly tracking key event and issue data about daily concerns, organizational concerns, and also more serious concerns for the purpose of early intervention. So by tracking even unique, isolated occurrences, think of them like snowflakes, seemingly unrelated, incredibly unique, you can actually get ahead of what caused the snowball. And as to the second question, how can leaders actually create better policies for their people? This is incredibly important because first, policies work best when they're anchored to principles and values aligned with a company's vision. Secondly, policies are best made together. And what I mean by that is that they're informed holistically by qualitative and qualitative feedback from customers, from their internal customers as well, aka their employees, from vendors, from partners, team, leadership, the board, legal, multiple stakeholders. And this is really where quantitative data about things like teams that are having performance issues, individuals who are feeling excluded, or certain groups who are feeling excluded, or where conversations about compensation are beginning to happen. These can all be very informative if tracked regularly and early. And ultimately, a policy is only as good as its practice. So make it real. The hardest part of a policy is translating it to a set of procedures, kind of a how-to manual, and then distilling it into a practice that works in every day, something that can become routine, can become embedded, can be something that's second nature. Teams are always evolving. Business needs are always evolving, particularly in small businesses and startups. And good people policies, for that reason, have to be reviewed and revised quite often.
Great, thank you. Okay, this conversation has been so interesting. Sonia, Alex, do you have any closing remarks that you would like to share? Any suggestions or recommendations? And are there any policies that you think that we should be supporting?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. So it's not enough for companies to start and stop the conversation at representation and hiring. Companies, particularly small businesses and startups, they need to be putting equal attention to how they can engage, grow, and advance employees from equity deserving groups. And this should be a reciprocal relationship that can help attract more talent from underserved groups, knowing that they're going to be respected for who they are, which fuels greater engagement and so on, in order to power a so-called equity flywheel.
Great, thank you, Sonia.
Sure. So I think from, just solely from a data lens, if there's just a policy around what are the standards by which high tech have to report and what the public has access to would be really informative. Even making it standard that technical roles is something that is reported would be fantastic, so that we're not relying on corporations to do the work themselves. Because even now, what we see is a company like Amazon has a technical workforce, but they're still not giving us those numbers. They're giving us corporate numbers. And as abysmal as that is, we can just imagine what technical roles within a corporation like that will be. So I think that just being having a policy around what the standards are for reporting and making that standardized across companies would be essential.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you both for sharing your insights. I would also like to thank the organizations that signed on to our letter to the EEOC requesting an updated diversity and high-tech report. And for everybody watching, we hope that you will use this information from the conversations that we've had to advance change in your organization. Thank you for watching.